it's not a dumpster fire, but it'll do.
It's pretty nice.
Yeah. So thanks, Peter Paul, for joining us. We're AmsterdamJS, which is probably, your arch enemy on the web in some ways, but
not at all.
Not at all.
I mean, I think I actually spoke at one of the very first AmsterdamJS meetings ever.
Wow.
I think it was in the Cloud9 offices.
Really?
Then. Yes, I think so.
I have a black hole in my memory there.
Keizersgracht, somewhere over there.
Yeah, I think we were buying free beer for infinity, right, at the time?
Yeah, could be. I talked. I talk for a living. I will continue to talk until somebody shuts me up. But go ahead.
So to do a bit of context, who has met PPK before?
Few.
That's awesome. So I mean, PPK I think is an icon in the web developer world, really, and has done a ton of stuff for the scene and for people involved. And I mean, I remember just going a lot to Quarks mode and learning about all the different things. Browsers would be supporting or not. Why don't we dive in there? But I'm curious. Why did you start this?
Why did I start it? Because there was nothing. Back in 1998, listen, this is like a really long time ago. Back in 1998, we wrote JavaScript on those marble slabs, right? And we have to carefully chisel out all the stuff that we want to write. And we made a mistake. We had to order a new marble slab. And when we were done, it wouldn't work in any browser whatsoever. So it was really a different time. But back then, there was Netscape 4 and IE4. Who here remembers Netscape 4?
I do.
Okay, a few. You know how terrible it was. Oh, there's a new Netscape 4 version. Let's see if our sites crash on it. That was really like what...
Well, wait a second. I think that NetBeans IDE, while running website simulation, still uses sort of that wild web browser. So you can use it even today.
Well, I mean, it was just a terrible browser. I mean, let's not mince words.
Well, actually, according to Netscape 3, it was a giant leap forward, right?
I used to think so, but not anymore. But let's not quibble about browsers who are dead and gone for a long time.
Yeah, but
in any case, the point I was trying to make was you had Netscape 4 and IE4, and you had to write radically different JavaScript for the two, because back then Netscape and Microsoft couldn't agree on anything, especially not on web standards. And there were a lot of sites that said, yeah, you can use this cool effect, this drop-down menus or something. Drop-down menus were real hot and happening back then. It was something completely new and very revolutionary. And they said, okay, this is a script for Netscape 4, and this is a script for IE4. And you combine them like this. And I said, yeah, that's fine, but where can I find more information? Why does this work in Netscape 4, and why does that work in IE4? Basically, there was nothing, so I said, okay, I'll do it myself. I'll figure it out myself. I mean, I had a very rough time at the start because it was just impossible to get some features right. I vividly remember this was back in 2000 or so. So, okay, I'm now going to write the definitive drag and drop script for Netscape 4 and IE4 and IE5 and a few other browsers. I couldn't get it to work. And the worst part was I had an example that actually did work, and the problem was Netscape 4 on Mac. And I had an example that did work in Netscape 4 on Mac, but I couldn't figure out why that example worked and mine did not.
Don't you think that you just hit the nail why developers like web development? Because it's just a giant puzzle. And it just gives them this little bit to make it work. It's incredible.
I mean, you actually get a real sense of achievement once you got something working in all browsers. I mean, you will all have found that at a certain point in your career. Oh, wow. And now I do this and that, and I branch my code like this, and now all of a sudden it works everywhere. Okay, let's not touch it anymore.
So I wonder, when did you realize that what you were doing was something, that it had like some impact? Like I'm always wondering, like when you want to build something, at some point you're wondering, are people using it? Like, is what I'm building kind of worth something? Are people liking it? How did that develop for you? Like, what was the moment when you were like, okay, wow, what I'm building now, people are using, it's actually having impact? Did you see that?
You mean my site?
Yeah.
I kind of started to realize it when I got more mail and more mail and more mail, and people asked me, okay, do you know about this? No, I'm sorry, I don't know. What an interesting bug.
Yeah, why doesn't this work on IE on Mac and stuff like that?
Yeah, that was a wholly different topic, of course. But what really drove it home for me personally was the very first web conference ever in Europe at Media 2005. Who here was at Media 2005 in London? Nobody. Well, it was epic. In the sense that it was something that had just never happened, right? There were, let's call it 400 people together, and they were all web developers, so they were all kind of doing what I did, right? With HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and they kind of all came together and started talking to one another, and there were interesting presentations, so there were lots of beers. And when you, excuse me, when you complained about a certain Netscape or IE bug, they actually understood what you were talking about. Not like your manager or something who just says, yeah, make it work. Yeah, but it's really impossible. I don't care, make it work. No, here you could talk to some people who actually said, yes, we know it's impossible. Terrible, isn't it? Have another beer. Yes, let's have another beer. And that's what you're looking for, you know? I kind of assume that's why most of you are here right now, just to find some people who go through the same pain as you do.
Yeah, definitely. What is the hardest thing you found ever in web development?
The hardest thing wow.
Where you really were like, this is just not possible. You know, you walk right around and then it doesn't work, and you walk around left around and then it does work. Like our video system tonight.
It's terrible, your video system? It works in browsers?
Supposedly, yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, but we have to plug it in a particular order into the computer.
Of course,
it's amazing.
obviously.
It's almost web development.
Yes. Technically speaking, I don't know. At least I've gone through so much that I can't remember one specific
What
one.
about the mobile space?
Yes, I was coming to that.
Okay.
I mean, I was very fortunate in the sense that I could already start with mobile web development back in 2009, when it was not on the agenda of the average web developer.
Fortunate with quotes, right?
Well, no, it was hard work. Nikolai knows about this. We cooperated for a while. You know, I came in this lab in the Vodafone offices in Düsseldorf, and they said, yeah, we've got 3 cupboards full of mobile phones here. Really, 3 cupboards full of mobile phones. There must have been 200 or 300. And as far as we're concerned, you can test all of them. Which was kind of cool, but I also thought, yeah, it's maybe a bit too much. And there were some really, really weird devices there. So I decided to skip it and say, okay, I'm going to start with the modern Nokias. Well, doesn't matter. What I noticed then is, first of all, that there were a lot more browsers on mobile than there were on desktop. Right? Even today, that's still true. But I kind of expected that. I wasn't really surprised by it. What I was surprised by is how few web developers were really interested in all that. What I've noticed time and again in my career is that web developers dislike testing on more than 2 or 3 browsers. As far as I'm concerned, that is the core of web development, is making sure that your stuff works everywhere. And it won't work perfectly, of course. There will be some errors here and there, and you have to code defensively in order to solve those errors. But my biggest surprise really was, okay, I found out all this cool stuff about browsers nobody ever heard of, and nobody really cared. That's still the case nowadays.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think web developers think, okay, well, we've got enough on our plate already. You know, we've got to get this working and that working, it's all terrible, and oh God, I'm so glad it works now in Chrome, and it works in Safari, and it works in IE, and it works in Firefox. Okay, we're done now. Okay, thank you. And I can kind of imagine, I had the same feeling myself, but it's still something that bothers me. There's a question from the audience.
Yeah, the question that I wanted to ask is exactly about the statement that you've just made about the browsers. About the statement that you've just made about the browsers, that it should work everywhere, in your opinion. By saying work everywhere, do you mean also the outdated browsers or outdated versions of actual browsers as well?
In theory, yes. In practice, it's difficult. Yes, I know. But this is one of the problems from having with modern web development. It feels as if we stopped caring about that. And I'm not saying, I'll get to you in a moment. I'm not saying that I can't understand why you say, at a certain point you say enough is enough. But there is a certain trend I'm noticing towards saying, okay, we kind of clean our hands from the browsers at all. We just say we have a tool chain and now it works because the tool chain will make sure that it does work. And I fundamentally disagree on a fundamental level with that. We have to continue testing on all the browsers. Not because we have to make our website work perfectly on those older browsers, that's impossible, but in order to make sure that the users get at least a decent experience, that at least they can read the text and fill out a form.
Right,
and
but
click
you
on
know,
links.
browser vendors have been really working hard to get their release cycles almost immediate, right?
Yes.
So it's also a measure of which browser space or user space you're targeting. If you're like corporate intranet,
Yes, that is different.
very different from startup, right?
True, absolutely. But it's the problem I'm having with browser release cycles. First of all, I have a personal problem as a browser tester. I mean, it's wonderful for the rest of the world, but it's terrible for me because it happened several times that I was in the middle of some very complicated tests. And, you know, I would continue the following day, and the following day I started my computer, and the bloody browser has updated. That is atrocious. If you're testing in Chrome 46, I want to finish my test in Chrome 46 and not switch to 47 halfway through. That's the one problem I personally have with release cycles. The other problem that you sometimes see is that people tend to forget that not everybody is on that release cycle. I mean, there are plenty of mobile phones sold, for instance, in China, which have the latest Google Chrome on them at the moment that they've been sold, but don't contain the Play Store, so cannot be updated. And that is something people tend not to realize too much.
Okay.
Wait a minute, there is a question from the audience there.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's something very interesting I think you're saying, and we seem to be skirting the issue, but when the computer tells me if you use this or that, you're supporting 95% of all users out there, I'm happy. But I'm not sure I'm hearing that you would also be happy.
Define supporting. I mean, if you say on 95% of my users' computers my website works perfectly, that's great. But what about the other 5%? Your website will not work perfectly, that's impossible because their browsers are so old, but will they at least be able to read the text?
Yeah, I'm arguing pretty much completely broken. The sort of Twitter, you can't press the tweet button anymore. And
yeah, but that's terrible. I think that we as web developers not doing our jobs when we do that. Lose a lot of functionality? Yes, of course we do. But you should be able to, what I said, read text and fill out forms.
I mean, this might sound kind of obvious, but you're saying that every person should be able to access what you're building. That's kind of what you're saying.
Yes.
Right.
It depends. I mean, if you're creating a very specialized app for a corporate intranet, yes, of course it's different. But to me, it's about the principle of the matter. I think we should try a little harder. I think we should spend a few hours at least to make sure, you know, just start up your favorite browser, turn off JavaScript, load your site. And then make sure that you can access the information and can fill out forms. That's really it.
Yeah, so that brings me to a very interesting question for me is that how do you define a browser? What is that thing?
A browser is a piece of software that interprets HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Okay, and is that documents? Is that applications? Is that games? Do you have a specific?
No, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
What about links?
Excuse me?
Links.
Links are a part of HTML.
It doesn't read CSS, if I'm correct.
There are a few browsers that do not read CSS. Oh, you mean links? Ah, okay, sorry, now I understand you. Yes, it's a browser. Mostly for historical reasons. If it were to be released today, I would not count it as a browser. But because it's been around forever, I'd say, okay, it's a browser.
So what do you think about dropping historic compatibilities? Is the web something that is supposed to work? Like, should I be able to load up a site from '98, or is it? Can we
awesome
break
would
it?
that be? I mean,
Yeah, I mean-
imagine
Well,
you
I
could
mean,
see all your
sites from '98 work. I mean, I forgot who tweeted it, but I think it was Brian Rieger, I'm not 100% sure. But he said, yeah, you know, nowadays, sites that were written 10 years ago, they work fine. But sites that were written 2 years ago don't. because we're too much invested in always using the new stuff because it is new stuff, and we should be using new stuff because it's good on our CV.
Right. So you know, us JavaScript developers have been using JavaScript to sort of like pave over all of the humps in the browsers, right? The compatibilities. And now with the rise of React, we've sort of disconnected completely from HTML as a definition structure. What do you think about that?
Terrible. I mean, it again goes back to what I said earlier. Your website should work for everyone, which means they should be able to read the text, which means you need basic plain HTML.
Right, but so that's what I'm saying. Like the definition of what a browser is for you is more aligned to being a document viewer than being an application platform.
But they can do both.
Isn't that maybe the cause of most of the pain, that there is no clear definition and that everybody's trying to do both whilst not having a focus on it?
Maybe, possibly, I don't know. I mean, if you were to make a browser today that does not support HTML, you will be laughed out of business. Same for CSS, same for JavaScript. So that's why I define a browser as a piece of software that supports HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. What we do with it can depend heavily on one of those three legs. I mean, the really, really old sites from the early 90s, they are basically only plain HTML with a bunch of images, but they still work fine. And then we started to use a lot of JavaScript back in the DHTML days. Then we cut back on the JavaScript, and we returned to JavaScript from the rise of the first libraries. You know, it's all a cyclical pattern. It might come to pass that we start to rely less on JavaScript in the future. I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm saying we should be ready for that eventuality.
I was just kind of thinking maybe it's really more of a thing of that the libraries should be. Like, I'm lazy, really. I just want to build something. I guess we're all lazy.
Everybody's lazy.
No, but it's just like so much work to make everything, work in everything.
Well, I mean,
make it accessible. So, like, I mean, maybe your library could just do everything, and then, we can just sort of build for one platform, and the rest is covered automatically.
Well, I am not saying that you should test on every single browser out there, because that's impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, even I don't have a complete list of all browsers out there. I mean, it was only 2 months ago that I saw on a friend's phone, a very old phone, a browser I've never heard of. And it's a completely shitty browser, and you should definitely not test your website on it, but it wasn't on my list. Which means that you have to get into the habit of defensive coding. It's saying, okay, I've written this cool JavaScript that perfectly displays my data if this user supports this and that and that. If you spend 3 weeks on that, you can spend a few hours on the opposite use case. Okay, but suppose it just doesn't work. Can we just send the data as HTML tables or whatever? I mean, I don't think I'm asking too much if I say that you should spend about 10% of your time on non-optimal use cases, such as all the browsers. And it's what I said before, just turn off your JavaScript, fire up your site, and see what works and what doesn't. That's really all I'm asking of you.
That's a great idea. I think we'd be shocked. I would be.
Yeah, there are certain problems with certain sites, yes.
Yeah.
So let's keep it at that.
So in your testing abilities, you of course have a lot of contact with browser vendors, right?
Yes.
So what is that contact like? Do they love you? Do they hate you?
It's a mixture of both. Especially Google is becoming an interesting love-hate relationship.
Yeah, I saw your latest inner views.
Yeah, well, yeah, in the width and in the height. I am guardian of the viewports, and I tell them what you're doing now is just plain wrong. I'm not going to go into the technical details because that would require a presentation of its own. Suffice it to say that I think Google has made a minor but serious mistake in Chrome 61, and I'm going to call on them in public.
And in your experience, does that work?
It worked last time. I mean, we had exactly the same issue a year and a half ago, and then they backtracked and said, okay, yeah. So maybe, we don't know. But this is a very technical topic, so I don't want to go into.
No, I'm just trying to focus on the interaction you have as a
Yeah,
person.
no, I mean.
So do you call on other people to support your case?
I try. That's why I blog. Though it seems that blogs are dead. Did you hear the news? Blogs are dead and everybody should write on Medium. I don't, but just so you know. I'm hoping that people will support me, of course. I will probably send out mails to other browser vendors just asking, hey, do you agree with this or not? Sometimes that helps. And sometimes they say, yeah, maybe we'll agree. Here's an argument.
And in your perspective, what does the landscape look like of browser vendors in the W3C? I mean, it's very opaque to us web developers, but you may have a view unique to us.
Ooh, Google, of course, has the upper hand right now. That's obvious. The rest of them tries to follow along where Google leads. Now the question becomes, is that good or bad? And I think it's a bit of both. Google takes the lead in most specifications we've seen over the past years. Some of them are excellent ideas, others not so much, or are just, you know, the problem with Google is that they over-engineer everything. They start out with an excellent idea, saying, hey, we should solve this use case. And web developers, no, that would be a great idea. And then they over-engineer to such an extent that nobody has the faintest clue what's going on anymore, and they have to download the library in order to actually use the specification. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is wrong.
And that includes progressive web apps?
Not sure yet. I hope not. It might include service workers, but not progressive web apps as such. But I'm not 100% sure.
Can you elaborate the service worker thought?
Because, well, I tried to study it a little bit. I failed, so I don't know too much about it. But it seems that it may be a little too low level. And I know that they did this deliberately, but it could be that they went too far off in that direction. But again, this is not a formal test-based comment, but just a feeling I'm having. Okay, so we have Google in this rather unique position because if the most apt comparison is, of course, with Microsoft of 10 years back. Microsoft was dominating the web world back then because IE had an, 85% market share. What did Microsoft do with it? Absolutely nothing. What does Google do with it? Rather too much, I would say. So we have to find a balance between the Microsoft model and the Google model. The rest of the browser vendors, well, Apple doesn't talk to anyone, so whatever. Microsoft is doing some pretty interesting stuff. I don't know about you, but I kind of like Edge. I mean, you will have a quibble, okay, it doesn't support this, it doesn't support that, but that's not quite what I mean. I mean that it's a good browser, and it will only become better, and especially that the mindset of Microsoft has changed vastly over the last few years. I mean, they used to talk to web developers, but now let's say they also listen, and listen really carefully. Firefox is in deep trouble because they missed the mobile boat. They were far too late in making the switch to mobile. If they've done it in time, if they had started on something Firefox OS-like back in 2007, 2008, they would still be a power to reckon with, but they have just plain missed that.
Is it not just because they keep, like iOS keeps other browser vendors off their platform?
They could have tried with Android. Why didn't they try to become the default browser for some certain Android vendor? I mean, that was the obvious thing, right? You had Android, Google made it free for reasons I won't get into now, but then Sony picked it up and Samsung picked it up and HTC and Huawei and all the other Chinese and Motorola, etc., etc., etc. They all needed a browser, but there really was only one browser, which I call Android WebKit, which is not Google Chrome, but the other browser that used to run on Android. If Firefox or anyone else would have stepped up and said, hey, we've got another browser for you, it would have led to an interesting situation, but they didn't. I mean, that is also one of the problems with the current Android ecosystem. I would love Google to have some competition there. I would love, for instance, Microsoft to step up and say, hey, we ported Edge to Android. How cool would that be? And on Android, you are required to use all of what's called Google Services, a certain package, or none of it. And Google Services includes things such as Google Play, Google Maps, many more interesting apps, and also Google Chrome. So if Microsoft were to say, hey, we've got a competing package for Google Services, that would be interesting. or any other vendor. In that light, the final browser vendor I want to mention is the newcomer, Samsung. Samsung is creating its own browser based on Chromium, but about a year ago it started talking to web developers. And if you know anything about the big Asian companies and communication, you will know that that is extremely unusual. Before that, Asian companies just didn't talk to web developers. Because that was, I don't know, beneath their dignity or something. I don't know. I tried, and I couldn't get anyone to talk to. That changed with Samsung. Potentially, possibly, maybe, Samsung could also become a competitor of Google on service level. So what we're seeing here is not really a browser war, but more who dominates the services on the mobile phone. And with the services, I just mean the apps you use really a lot. Right now, obviously, the answer is Google and Apple. And Apple has locked down iOS, so nothing will change there. But Android is still kind of open, so it will be very interesting to see what happens there.
Thanks a lot. I have a completely different question. So throughout your career, what's the one thing you would have liked to learn earlier rather than later? Like where you're like, oh, I really, like this is the one thing which kind of, which took me a while until I got it. Like if someone would have told me this earlier.
I still don't really understand SVG. Back again in 2009 when I worked at Vodafone, the people there said, yeah, SVG is really important to us because it scales. So we don't need to know how wide or how small the mobile phone display is. I said, yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I made a note and I've never took it any further. I should have learned SVG.
Okay. So on that note, have you ever lost faith in the web at some point in time where you were just like throwing out some phone into the window and just went like, this never happened?
For a while I had a special padded room where I was allowed to throw phones to the wall. But I was not losing faith in the web, but in that particular phone or in that particular browser vendor. No, I have never lost faith in the web. I have lost faith in the web developer community from time to time, especially now when we're still, when we're again going on with, the average site is just too big. It has too much JavaScript, too much stuff. Remove some of it. That's basically what should happen, but what won't happen. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. I won't go into it, but so I sometimes despair of web developers.
So where do you see this in 5 years or 10 years from now?
Good question. There is currently a school of thought, especially Peter Gaston in the UK and the Riegers in Canada, who say, yeah, the web is going to become much less important than it is today. Mostly because one of the Riegers said, okay, the browser is going to disappear as a consumer product. That is, consumers will turn to the browser fewer and fewer times because their needs are met by the Facebook app, the Twitter app, all kinds of apps.
Messaging.
Which is possible. Note that it does not mean that the browser will disappear as a technical piece of software, because a lot still has to happen under the hood. If the Facebook app shows a web page inside it, it uses a browser, obviously, because that's the only way of showing a web page. But if that happens, web development could become much less important than it is today, and I'm seriously wondering if that will be a bad idea, or if it would force us to concentrate on the core of our craft. Making something that just works for everybody, instead of putting in more and more JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, from that perspective, even like the concept of UI is changing a lot, right? You have like the whole messaging platforms and then serverless, and
Voice.
I mean, indeed.
I'm not a big believer in voice, but I may be wrong there. I mean, I'm not a specialist in any. AI is really interesting. Maybe one of the things we should keep our eyes on in the next 5 years is, will browsers support a meaningful level of AI? That is to say, simplistically put, can we connect to the camera and show basically what the user is looking at through his phone, and overlay something with interesting information in such a way that the experience is smooth? If the answer is yes, then the browser will be a first-class citizen of the AI world. If the answer is no, then we may have a problem. AR, augmented reality, I'm talking about. Right now, everybody's totally gung-ho on virtual reality. It has its use cases, especially in games and certain forms of industrial design and medical sciences. But other than that, I think for the average consumer, it will be much less interesting than augmented reality, is my guess right now. So we're seeing all these kinds of new things coming together, and I think that the browsers, especially Chrome, is still too much into the idea of emulating native apps, which is what we all decided 10 years ago would be a great idea, and I doubted it at the time. I continue to doubt it today. So yes, the browser landscape is going to change, and if the browser becomes relatively less important to companies who want to get their message out there, then web development will become less important as well. That's, yeah, it's a bit vague and a bit general, but that's the best I can say right now.
Thanks a lot. I'm really looking forward to the next. Denise, yeah, I think just briefly, I think we're kind of slowly wrapping it up. So why don't we turn it into questions?
Yeah, sure. If you can wait for the microphone, if there's a microphone. Yes, but we do need a microphone.
So when we are talking about browser, why we don't talk about a legendary browser, Opera? Because
Opera has clearly told us web developers we don't care about you anymore, because they fired their entire developer relations team, which was one of the best developer relations team in the world.
But why they did that? Because I was having a Symbian phone and Opera Mini was on it. And
Opera Mini is another case. Opera Mini is really, really interesting, and it's still part and parcel of my tests. I'm talking about Opera on desktop and Opera mobile. But the problem is that Opera has always been a fairly opaque company. It was never easy to talk to a technical person there as opposed to a developer relation person. And now it has become much worse because they fired all the developer relations people who we know, Bruce Lawson and Matthias Bijnens and a few others. So it has become impossible for us to talk to technical people. But even when they were still there, it was pretty hard to get hold of the Opera Mini team because they were kind of living in a separate reality or something, I'm not sure. But in any case, I would have to look at the latest stats and how Opera Mini is doing nowadays.
almost don't exist. Like
Excuse me?
it almost don't exist. Like nobody uses Opera Mini on an Android phone. I hardly see anyone using Opera Mini.
Well, I mean, but in which countries are we talking about?
Like I work for a very big airline company, and when we talk about browser compatibilities, we don't even list Opera Mini there. So it's less than 5% maybe.
Huh, interesting. I would have to look at the latest figure. I mean, it used to be that Opera Mini had a 20, 30, 40, up to even 80% market share in certain countries. For instance, Nigeria, but these are numbers from years ago, and I don't know the current numbers.
In Belarus right now, it's just a remark to the question about Opera Mini. In Belarus, we have 27 or 28% of Opera Mini users on mobile devices.
Really?
Yeah, true, because internet still costs a lot.
Yeah.
Like, not a lot, but it costs.
Yes, yeah, that is exactly the use case of Opera Mini. It saves people money, especially people who don't have a lot of money to begin with.
Should we have one last question?
I'll ask.
No, let's have someone else. Sorry.
There's also one over there.
Hello. Yeah. What do you think about the war going between these native apps and the web apps? Because they're trying to get merged. Every framework is trying to come with a native framework of their, like React Native, Angular, Native Script. Like, why there is a parallel war going on? Like,
I think it's a yesterday's war. I mean, I think that the war was pointless from the start, and that native apps have their certain tasks to do, and the web has another task to do. Besides, what you're seeing, especially in the Facebook and Twitter apps, if you click on a link that's being posted on Facebook or Twitter, where are you being brought to? To a browser in order to show the page that it's all about. So I think, people have always wanted to contrast the web to something else. It used, in the past few years, it was native apps. Before that, it was Flash. I mean, I don't know if anyone here remembers the HTML versus Flash debates that you used to have back, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. Those are also very boring debates because, you know, they are just different technologies and they have different use cases, so they should coexist peacefully together. Thank you so much. So, no, to be honest, the only problem, and I've already referred to this, is that browsers, browser vendors, especially Google, became obsessed by mobile native apps and said, oh yeah, the browser has to support everything that native apps support. For what reason? I don't know. That is really the only practical thing that the native versus web debate has done. But as far as I'm concerned, it's yesterday's debate and it's not really interesting anymore. There's, I think, one final question over there. Oh.
You're saying to try to turn off the...
Could you talk a little louder?
You're saying to try to turn off the JavaScript, but if your context based on some APIs which you can get an access just with JavaScript. For example, you have a modern IDE which implemented on WebGL, and without JavaScript you can't do this, right? So.
You mean when you are developing that modern IDE? Yes. That's okay, because if you develop a modern IDE, you have a certain list of things that should work in order for the IDE to work. So I'm not against that. It's just when you create an actual website, where you create something that theoretically should work for all consumers. Then you have to make that test. But if you're developing a very special piece of software, the microphone's gone down. A very specialized piece of software for a very specific target audience, I guess it's kind of okay. It's similar to intranets, you know? Yes, our intranet supports IE 10 and 11. Oh.
That is very comforting to know, because that's what I'm doing.
Oh, wonderful.
So, yeah, no, so WebGL is a new technology in which you essentially replace the entire display engine with something different, right? Something new. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as a good direction, or should all of the effort go into keeping HTML where it is?
Well, I mean, it's very simple. HTML browsers will have to continue to support HTML, right? You cannot just ditch HTML because that does not make sense, and you're not a browser anymore. Again, for WebGL, it comes to what use cases are there? Games, obviously. Anything else?
Well, like making applications that are easier than HTML. Multimedia, fast text rendering. You can do enormous amounts of things with WebGL that are actually much easier and better than HTML. But
yes, but would you create a website with that technology?
Technically, you could.
Yes, but would you?
That's the question. I'd say it's more focused on making apps or making interactive media or making augmented reality or virtual reality, but not necessarily documents. That's why I'm saying, what technology do you use a browser for, all right?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it's not a question of what you use the browser for, but what you use specific technology A for. What do you use WebGL for? Well, you made a very cogent point that there are certain use cases where it's excellently suited, and other use cases where you are better off with just plain old HTML. So that's fine.
All right. I think we're hitting our time limit.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I
think there was one more question from the audience. Or not?
So I think the issue is that we'll keep having these questions. It's gonna
oh!
Be one more.
The issue is that I talk too much.
No, the question.
And you didn't believe in talking. That was one of your remarks.
Yes.
So, yes.
One more? Okay, this is the last question.
Okay, what do you think about the browser as an operating system? Because it's implementing all those native APIs. What do you think about it? Because if you go 5-10 years, you would say you don't need Android native apps because the browser does all those things.
I think this goes back to what I said just now. What's the use case for this specific technology? In this case, certain APIs. And secondly, it says, okay, the browser must be able to do anything that native apps can do, which I disagree with. So I would say that some things are just not the job of the browser. So I think, well, maybe, but this is an idea I'm having right now on stage, and I haven't thought about it. Maybe it would be a wise idea to restrict ourselves a little bit in what we're actually doing. I mean, we want the web to be everything for everybody, and it can't be. There has to be a certain specific number of use cases that just cannot be met by plain old HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and where we are better off using a different technology. I think we as web developers should acknowledge that. I think we are very bad in finding our particular niche in the technological ecosystem as a whole. We want to be absolutely everybody, everything for absolutely everybody, and I think that's going to go wrong at a certain point in time. And I think this is a nice way to
All right.
close off.
Yeah.
Well, yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I hope it was fun for everybody. And
Let's give it a warm applause, indeed.